The book came out on October 3rd, and it is my effort to deal with this problem. And that is that many Christians in the US and elsewhere are today demonstrating an attraction to what I do describe in the book as a dangerous authoritarian and reactionary politics that poses a threat to democracy. So that's where the thesis begins. It begins with a factual claim that Christians are at the heart of threats to democracy in the US and in a number of other countries. That responsible Christians, the ethical path for Christians, the path of discipleship. I love all the language of discipleship on your website, by the way, how much you talk about discipleship here. That it is an appropriate part of Christian discipleship to commit or recommit to democratic practice. And partly to make that case, I propose that there are historic resources in the Christian tradition, rooted in Scripture, that have contributed to what could be described as at least a 500-year-old pro-democracy tradition in Christianity. A substantial part of it born here in this country, but elsewhere as well. So I want to renew the Christian case for democracy and to connect to our own specific Christian traditions in a time when a significant number of Christians are drifting away from democracy on the basis of a different vision of what Christian discipleship looks like or calls for. My book, I don't even need these glasses. Look at that. This is lovely. I can see you face to face. My book is a warning about what's called democratic backsliding or democratic deconsolidation. Especially, and that is basically when an established democracy begins to erode, when its practices begin to lose the loyalty of its people. When a consolidated democracy, which has for generations practiced the hallmarks of democracy, when a consolidated democracy begins to deconsolidate, to come apart. That's the situation I'm most interested in, because that's the situation that I believe we are seeing in the US and in some other countries as well. And I'm especially concerned about democratic backsliding or democratic deconsolidation that is aided and abetted by Christians who are tempted to or come to believe that taking apart a consolidated democracy or changing its fundamental character is an expression of Christianity. And I think in doing so, Christians are abandoning some of the best traditions that we have. And so that is essentially the overview of what the book is about. So each chapter has a header, and this is the header for the first chapter. Reinhold Niebuhr, he said in the older, more gender-exclusive language, he said, man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but man or human inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary. Mm-hmm. So Niebuhr, in a kind of a neo-Augustinian, sometimes called Christian realist perspective, writing in the middle of the 20th century, in the light of what had just happened, in the light of fascism and World War II and communism and the apocalyptic struggle for the survival of democracy in the West and a Western civilization as he saw it, he was, in his generation, attempting to make the case for democracy. And one way he did was to talk about human nature. That human nature has this paradox to it. We have a capacity to envision and to learn how to advance towards justice, fairness, and human relations. That it is always out there ahead of us. We never achieve it, but we know what it looks like inchoately, and traditions develop over time that we learn to understand this is what a more just society looks like. And so this is why democracy is possible, because we have the capacity to do this. We don't need to have a dictator tell us how to organize society. We can arrange it ourselves. We have that capacity. On the other hand, because of the broken aspect of human nature, our inclination to injustice, to domination, to privilege accumulating and not caring about people who are marginalized and oppressed, precisely because of that aspect of human nature as well, we need democracy to check human nature. In other words, democracy fits both the potential of the human being and the sinfulness of the human being. Democracy is the best system in both cases. A famous Niebuhrian phrase. So what is democracy? Yale political scientist Bruce Russert said, "A democracy is a political system in which nearly everyone can vote. Elections are freely contested. The chief executive is chosen by popular vote or by an elected parliament. And civil rights and civil liberties are substantially guaranteed." Another author, David Koizis, a Christian political scientist, said that democracy is characterized by universal franchise for adult citizens, by equal franchise power, which means every vote counts the same, by majority rule, by competitive elections in which everybody has a chance to organize parties and to have a shot at power, by the right of people to stand for public office. Anybody can file and stand for public office. By freedom of speech and of the press, which is essential to the ability to communicate ideas, to contest policies, and to run for office, and to cover what's happening in political life, and by rights charters that aim to protect core liberties and minority rights, and then by the rule of law embodied in a written or unwritten constitution. So this is two definitions of you might say, the rudiments of democracy, one a little more limited, another a little bit more elaborate. In a democracy, the people and or their representatives write the Constitution and the laws that fit with it. Leaders recognize that irresponsible or impulsive exercises of popular sovereignty must be constrained. So it isn't just what anybody feels like on a given day. So there are checks and balances built into the system so that impulsive or irresponsible actions are limited. And that you might say the majority will must be limited by the rule of law, by careful legislative deliberation, and by an independent judiciary which can review all laws and test them against the Constitution or whatever rights charters exist in a country. In a democracy, the law is made by the people and their representatives or their representatives. But in a paradox of democracy, the perceived legitimacy of laws that are made requires that laws reflect or are perceived to reflect transcendent or grounding principles that go beyond merely popular will. In other words, when people argue for laws, almost always they say, the reason this is a good law is it's more just, or it treats everyone equally, or it fits with our values as a society, or it advances the common good, or something like that. And so one of the earliest stated concerns about democracy as a form of government is that it would just be the will of a tyrannical majority, just doing whatever they want. And that is often how democracy has functioned. But in a well-functioning democracy, the actions of the majority are constrained by all kinds of limits, including the limit of the perceived legitimacy of a law fitting with principles and values that people generally agree are appropriate or have been already stated in the Constitution or in the charters, rights charters, and so on. A little bit more civics, as we say in our country, civics 101. In direct democracy, you have direct rule by the people. Everybody gathers in a room and votes, right? Generally, this is unworkable in communities of any substantial size, and so as societies get bigger, they develop representative democracy, in which the people choose representatives to do the work of governance. In the Federalist Papers, which is a a fundamentally important late 18th century statement in the U.S. By some of our founders as to what the Constitution, how it works and why it was designed the way that it was. This is described as republican government. Some people in the U.S. these days are drawing a distinction between democracy and republicanism in a new way that I've not heard before. In general, some of these voices that I'm concerned about are saying that the U.S. is not a democracy, it's a republic. As I read our founding documents, while the language of republic, and that's an old term, it goes way back, 18th century, while the language of republic, you can see some nuances, but fundamentally all it means, according to our own founders in the U.S., is we had a democratic republic, or you might say a republican form of democracy, in that it's not direct democracy. We elect representatives who make laws in our name and who are accountable to us through elections every couple of years, right? All of you probably have heard of John Locke, who beginning in the late 17th century was already articulating what became a kind of a foundational vision for democracy, sometimes described as liberal democracy or a libertarian vision for grounding democracy. And basically the paradigm that Locke proposed, and you can see it also in Hobbes before him, is that this was the first vision which was understood that the government doesn't flow from the king down, government flows from the people up. And the people create the primal institutions of government for their own self-interest. That the people make a social compact, sometimes called a social contract, to say, okay, we'd rather be on our own, basically. We'd rather just be left alone. That's a libertarian vision, right? We'd rather just be left alone, but we're afraid that if we don't have anybody to protect us, then marauders with weapons are going to come and break down our doors and kill us. And so we need to create some kind of central authority to guarantee security, a measure of freedom, privacy, and property rights. And so this idea of liberal democracy was, in the Lockean form, was very limited vision of government, essentially exists to guarantee security and property and privacy. It doesn't propose a substantive shared vision of the common good. The government allows people to pursue their own private vision, you might say, of their good, and just gets out of the way and lets people do that, except insofar as their vision of their personal good impinges on the rights of other people. This is a libertarian vision. Now, what's interesting is there was critique then, and there is question now as to whether the lack of a shared vision of the common good is ultimately sustainable in a community, in a political community. One argument is that there was an assumption in Locke's day that the shared kind of religious background of his own context and the culture that had been birthed from that background was sufficient. In other words, if we all share a broad background of Christian or Jewish and Christian values, we don't need the government to do that for us. We do that culturally. All that the government does is to keep us from killing each other, basically, right? And to keep you from coming in my house and taking my stuff. And even that, you don't need a lot of that on the average basis, because the average person has already been trained by family, church, and culture to not break into your house and take your stuff, right? So now, but what happens if a cultural background that you might say enables us to have a limited government, if a broad cultural consensus or near consensus, what happens if that doesn't exist? And I think that's where we find ourselves in a lot of cultures today. In essence, one of the things that can happen is that the government is asked to do more and more to create, or at least to create the illusion of shared values that we can organize a society around. But then if you have factions in the society and in the government that have fundamentally different visions of the common good, or of right and wrong even, then in essence you have a constant whiplash in terms of the values of the society and the laws that ought to flow from those values if there is fundamental disagreement. And I think that's happening here, and I think it's happening in the US as well. Okay, we'll say more about that later. There are organizations that exist to try to encourage democratic practice. In my book, I talk about Freedom House, which I believe is a European-based organization. And what they do is they offer what they call measures of democratic health. And so what they do at Freedom House on their website is they assess the democratic health of every country that they examine. And they use criteria that they then apply to all the countries, and there are two main criteria, political rights and civil liberties. Okay, so political rights. How do you know you have a relatively healthy democracy? You can look at this list and see how it's working here. Free and fair elections, and the administration of elections is trusted and respected. Freedom to form political parties. They can come, they can go. By the way, one of the things that is not working well in our country is we have two entrenched political parties that hate each other, and that have roughly half of the people, except for the people in the middle who aren't happy with anybody. But the way parties kind of come and go in parliamentary systems, I think, is actually a little bit healthier. We don't have that, and that's not helping us. Anyway, the freedom to form political parties, realistic opportunity of the opposition to gain power through elections that are fair. Various segments of the population, all the segments have full political rights and opportunities, so it's not race-based or who's been here the longest or who has the most money or whatever. Policies are set by elected leaders only, not being bribed or being coerced by people behind their back. Interesting to think about that a little bit, right? There are strong safeguards against government corruption. There is government openness and transparency as far as possible. Okay? It's a pretty nice list. Then on the civil liberties side, there's free and independent media. Footnote, corporate-owned media, is it free? Freedom of religion and freedom for non-belief. Academic and educational freedom, in other words, the government is not unduly involved in say, what colleges are teaching. Maybe not involved at all. Freedom of political expression, freedom of assembly, freedom for non-governmental organizations and trade unions, what's called civil society. An independent judiciary that is not corrupted by bribery or by political pressure. Due process under law, everybody, there's a certain set of rights if you get arrested, all of that. Equal treatment of all segments of the population, freedom of movement, freedom to own property and start businesses, equality of opportunity, and freedom from economic exploitation. So what Freedom House does, and you can go to their website, freedomhouse.org, is they do a year-by-year assessment of the democratic health of different societies, and they assess the direction of movement, either away from democratic health or towards democratic health, with a point value. And in a number of countries, the direction of movement has been destructive. It's been backwards, including ours, including the US. Okay? Alternatives and threats to democracy. C.S. Lewis said, I am a Democrat because I believe in the fall. He didn't mean like autumn. He meant, human nature. Right? So it's the same basic idea. And he wrote that during World War II, with the bombs falling. So if you look back in the kind of the history of politics, there was an interesting experiment with democracy in ancient Athens. And it's interesting to study. It was essentially direct democracy, and it was an experiment which lasted hundreds of years, but in the end it was believed a failed experiment. But still, you can study it. Despite that rare kind of exception, modern constitutional democracy is a relative latecomer to human politics. as I look back, let me go back, there it is, yeah. Essentially, broad brushstrokes, after the agricultural revolution in the ancient world, most sizable city-states centralized power in ruling elites or absolutist monarchies, many of which developed imperial ambitions. And a lot of the history that you, like when you study Hebrew Bible, you encounter these ancient empires, the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans. And in essence, the history of the ancient world is a history of these vast empires. These what eventually became, or from the beginning, were absolutist kind of states. In all of these, religion and politics were closely aligned or even fused. The attempt to separate religious and political institutions is a long-standing challenge in ancient Egypt or Assyria or Babylon. The idea that the ruler is divine or appointed by the divine, or that the elite is divine or whatever, is deeply embedded in almost all of these regimes. So the idea that a government is actually better off disentangled from religion is a relatively recent development, and many of us at least believe it to be essential for a healthy modern democracy. I think that there is an interesting difference in the covenantal tradition. The first time I'll use that word, but not the last. The covenantal tradition of the Hebrew Bible. Of course, I think you have strains in the Hebrew Bible. You have this kind of royal dynasty, divinely appointed once you get into the kings. But before that, you have a covenantal tradition, a theocratic covenantal tradition. And Michael Walzer is among those who have argued that the covenantal Hebraic tradition has democratic potentialities, you might say. Among them, that God alone is king and giver of law, and this means that everybody in the covenant community who voluntarily assents to be a part of the community, everybody is equally subordinated to God's law, and everybody can be held accountable to that law, including the king. Thus, David can be challenged for his violation of the law by the prophet. And David can say, I have sinned, you are right, as opposed to just executing the one who would challenge him, right? Which is what would happen everywhere else. So the idea of covenant, now initially this is God's law, agreed by the people, everybody accountable equally to the covenant. The role of the prophets to remind people of the nature of the law and to hold especially the elites accountable, because it's the elites who want to drift free from it. This is a resource for democracy and has been thought of as such in a lot of Christian political ethics. Modern democracy was a gradual development, traceable especially to the late 16th and early 17th century. Its birth or evolution reflected lessons learned, hard lessons learned, regarding the dangers of political absolutism, as well as the demands of a rising bourgeois class, the economic changes associated with the rise of early capitalism. Here I want to connect to, and I'll say this, and I say it everywhere that I can, Baptists were among the dissenting and persecuted Christians who in the early modern world, including in this country and elsewhere, played a key role in demanding limits on state power, in pleading for religious liberty. Please let us worship God according to our own conscience. In arguing for some kind of fundamental rights charters, the right to religious liberty, the right to be left alone on the basis of your conscientious beliefs, and calling for democratic participation. So the proto-democratic movements in what became the United Kingdom and in other places and in the US as well were supported especially by dissenting Christians who knew what state church power and persecution tasted like in their bones. So one thing I'm saying to people of the Baptist and Anabaptist and nonconformist and dissenting traditions is, you know all about about the abuse of state power in the name of God. And we are fundamentally important in defending against proposals for further abuse of state power in the name of God that are being offered in a number of countries. So this is the Christian dissenting path to democracy, which was ahead of, actually chronologically ahead of, the Lockean liberal path. And so most scholars, at least of American democracy, say it was both of these that helped to create what we developed in the US. It was both a kind of a Lockean liberalism and a Christian covenantalism and democratic dissenting strands. And that helped to create the conditions for the birth of the US. Very interesting. And some American Christians have lost all memory of that. So, you have democratic revolutions spreading in the 19th century into the 20th century. And then you have this crisis of democracy where it's kind of, fascism rising and communism emerging. And the question is, if you've got three main powers, communism on the extreme left, fascism, Nazism on the extreme right, can democracy survive this? And it did during and after World War II. And then once communism collapsed in Europe in the late 80s, early 90s, it briefly looked like the democracy was kind of going to be the default political system. And people were talking about the end of history. That lasted about like a year or something, because nothing ever stands still in politics. So today there are many signs of democratic backsliding and deconsolidation. My book is especially concerned about democratic backsliding from the right, from the authoritarian right, as I'll call it. But in the US right now, both the left and the right, you might say, are accusing each other of authoritarian tendencies. And if you look at books, like I'll admit, I go to Amazon sometimes to see how my book is doing, right? And if there are certain lists, right, of books in a certain area, every other book is from the opposite side, right? So here's a book from a really conservative author saying, the problem is those leftist totalitarians, the woke totalitarians, right? And then the next book is my fine book, and then the next book is, the same. And so part of the distress visible in our country, my country, is that the sense that the rudiments of a kind of a functioning liberal democracy in which you have civility and mutual respect, you may disagree, but you fight it out nonviolently in elections and you respect the results and then you do it again next time, that's eroding, with an increasing sense of apocalyptic threat from the other who is increasingly demonized. And so the idea that we don't actually have a liberal democracy anymore, what we have is an illiberal, either woke, I get that word woke here a lot, right? Okay. And a liberal woke totalitarianism where the liberal elites tell you what to believe and enforce it by law. Or in a liberal right totalitarianism where the right-wing people want, it's like one side or the other and it switches back and forth. That's kind of, that's the atmosphere of conversation in our country right now. In the chapter, I talk about delineations between nationalism, fascism, and populism. In the US right now, the main term that is being used by liberal critics of what's happening on the Christian right is Christian nationalism. In this book, I'm not really satisfied with that as the main label. I'm going to propose a different label. And the term that I use is authoritarianism. Authoritarianism, defined here, the weakening or loss of popular sovereignty, the rejection or destruction of political pluralism, the entrenchment of a dominant individual or party, an end to genuinely free and fair elections, escalating attacks on political freedom and participation, erosion of constitutionalism, rule of law, civil liberties, and civil rights. Now, some people who are really worried think that what we have in the US right now is a turn towards fascism. That language is out there. A lot of people prefer the word like Christian nationalism or just nationalism. Some people say the issue is populism. Kind of out of control demagoguery around populism, those elites are taking your country away from you. You need to rise up and take it back, kind of populism language. All of that, and I explore each of those in the book, but I think authoritarianism is at least what I want to study and which I'm most concerned about. Here's another interesting thing. In 2018, reflecting on the US situation with Trump 2 years into his presidency, he would have been 1 year in when this book was finished. These political scientists say, this is what authoritarian political behavior looks like in a democracy. Rejection of the democratic rules of the game, denial of the legitimacy of political opponents, toleration or encouragement of political violence, and a readiness to curtail the civil liberties of opponents and of the media. And they said in 2017 that they thought they were witnessing this on the part of Trump already then. But it's interesting. Part of what they show is democracy is not just about the formal structures that I introduced earlier. It's also about the norms. It's about kind of how you conduct yourself in public life. My understanding is, I don't want to offend anybody here, you might have loved this fellow, but that Boris Johnson here was understood by some people at least as a threat to the norms of democratic practice here. Not just a violation of rules, but norms. This is how we do democracy here. But those norms depend on leaders being willing to play by those rules. If they don't play by those rules anymore, then the norms themselves weaken. That also means that the next person may be more likely to violate the norms as well, right? So, example, one of the democratic rules that we had of the game, and I think Freedom House would say it's important in every culture, is that the political leaders do not cast doubt, except under extraordinarily obvious circumstances, on the fairness of election processes. You don't say somebody was manipulating the voting machines. You just don't do that. Because what it does is undermine confidence in the count every single time. So you don't do that. You don't say, this person is not really in America. This opponent of mine is not really one of us. This person should be in jail. You don't say, like at your rallies, you don't allow violence to break out at your rallies. You don't encourage armed militias. General principle of democracy, you don't encourage armed militias. You don't say such and such is the enemy of our country and should be in jail. Or the media is the enemy of the people and should be shut down. If I'm ever elected president, I'm going to shut down. I'm going to go after CNN or whatever. You just don't do that. So they help to see that democracy is not just about constitutions and laws, but about norms, practices, and culture. Democratic cultures depend on adherence to norms. And like anywhere else, you don't really realize how important a norm is until you watch it being violated. Here's an example. I don't know if this is a big deal here, but the norm that you don't deface public property or private property, like with graffiti. It's a norm, right? I like to walk down the street and see that the property's been respected. Once that norm begins to erode, then it's really hard to recover it. And so on. So I'm suggesting that democratic norms must be protected, but for those norms to be protected, the people who are put forward by major political parties to be candidates must all be committed to the norms. Even if they lose, they remain committed to the norms. I propose in this book, the main diagnostic category that I introduce in the book is what I call authoritarian, reactionary, Christianity. This is my language here, trying to bend history backwards toward a pre-modern world of Christian political and cultural hegemony, white Christian political and cultural hegemony, especially, but I'll unpack this. So I work with two main words here, authoritarianism and reactionary. So beginning with authoritarianism, I think many Christians are essentially authoritarian in their understanding of religion and morality. By this I mean their understanding and practice of religious truth, religious and moral truth, and of authority in religious institutions and other institutions that they control is hierarchical and centralized. That essentially we know the truth. The truth is something we either have inherited biblically or through tradition, or there are authoritative interpreters of the truth who tell us what the truth is. It could be the patriarch of an Eastern Orthodox church. It could be the Pope in Rome. And look at, like, right now we have a Pope challenging aspects of tradition, which is really problematic for a lot of people, right? It could be the all-authoritative pastor in the church. It could be the parents. It could be the principal at the school. We know that Rosa and Ed exercise dictatorial power here, and so we must challenge that right now. Viva la revolution! Okay. So I'm proposing that Christianity was born in the pre-modern, long ago, centuries ago, in a pre-modern world, and that Christianity carried forward many authoritarian tendencies into the modern world. And so this means, and we have to recover this history honestly, that for Christians over time to embrace democracy beginning in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries required either the abandonment of aspects of authoritarian tradition, or the reinterpretation of tradition, or the modification of the understanding of power, tradition, and history. In other words, Christians had to learn some things to embrace democracy. Now, as I said, the primal Christian Democrats were the dissenters who knew that the state church structures did not have a proper claim on absolute truth, that they were wrong, and they were certainly wrong in killing people for believing differently. And so you had democratic impulses already. But it's actually rather interesting if you think about Christendom and the Christian Roman Empire after Constantine, and Christian governments all over, the Christian Kingdom of Denmark, the Christian Kingdom of France, the Christian Kingdom of whatever, all over Europe. And then for democracy to be born, and for this ancient, rather authoritarian, non-democratic tradition to adapt to democracy took some work. New things had to be learned. Tradition had to be reinterpreted. New resources in the scripture, new ways of looking at Jesus, new ways of thinking about community had to be developed. I think it is clearer now that not all Christians made the move. Not all Christians made the democratic turn. Either then or now. Or another way to say it is that older non-democratic or authoritarian traditions in Christianity are always available for retrieval. You can always call them back. We want, Joshua to surround the city and conquer it again. We need a king. We need King David again. We need King Jesus to rule. And there's lots of non-democratic tropes and figures and traditions and texts that are available. It's always available, right? A tradition is like a toolbox. You can open the toolbox. You can get out of the toolbox whatever you find most helpful or most compelling. So I'm saying that authoritarianism is in our toolbox. And I don't say it here, but in this lecture, but I say it in the book. It is now more clear that since the 70s at least, there are Christian subcultures in the US that are training young people in non-democratic understandings of politics. It's especially in the homeschool and Christian school subculture. I learned to my horror that when my daughter was in the 3rd grade at a Christian school, she was being taught a civics curriculum that was called the principle approach. And I remember, how you're not necessarily paying that close attention to what's being taught until you discover a problem, right? The principle approach at this Christian school basically said, I could pull it out of the book, that America is or should be a godly republic in which the law of God as derived from Scripture should be the law of the land. That the true basis of society is not majority will, but the law of God. So basically she was being taught what I would say was a kind of a 17th century Puritan vision of civics. Now people who are being explicitly taught that and intentionally are being taught that from homeschool and Christian school curriculum all the way through. And some of these folks are now our legislators. But it's also more subtle than that. It's authoritarian tendencies, right, more broadly. As for reaction, and this gets to your question, and it also speaks to Josh's question earlier, reaction, the politics of reaction. A.O. Hirschman says that you can count on dramatic changes in a society will tend to evoke equally dramatic negative reactions against them. Thrust, counter-thrust is how politics and culture work. And he says that, and this actually, the term of being a political reactionary goes back to the French Revolution and what happened after that. The reactionaries were those who were against all of that. And in general, a reactionary is somebody who says no to everything new and sets their feet firmly in the soil and says, I will not be moved, I will not change my mind, you will not convince me that this is okay. I argue in the book that a traditionalist Christian reactionary politics is visible from the very earliest stirrings of the modern world. While you had like some of the dissenters saying, give us democracy and some basic rights, please stop killing us. You had other Christians saying, no, divine right of kings. Reinforce the way things are. How dare you challenge God's will and God's organization of society, all of that, right? So from the very earliest stirrings of the modern world, there were Christians who were opposed to democracy, religious liberty, the enfranchisement of Jews or Muslims, equal rights across religion and race and gender and so on. So in between chapters, which I probably won't have time to go over today, I describe the politics of reaction in 19th and early 20th century France and 19th and early 20th century Germany, which laid the groundwork for fascist turns in the politics of both countries. In France, it helped to lead up to Pétain and the Vichy regime, and in Germany it helped to lead up to fascism, where you had Christians heavily involved in saying, everything that has happened since 1789 is bad. We say no. And when politicians came along to say, we will turn back the clock and make things better, or we will make Germany great again, or make France great again by resisting everything that has happened since, and that would be, anti-capitalism, anti-urbanism, anti-industrialism, anti-people moving off the land, anti-immigration, everything, right? So waves of reaction are visible in different cultures at different times, but I would say, and this gets back to the questions we just had, is that I think, at least in the US, since the 60s, there has been a fierce negative response to every social change since the 1960s in our country. And in the book, I talk about many examples of these changes, but just as an example, just kind of begin to go through it. In 62, our Supreme Court said there can be no school-sponsored prayer. This was the first, maybe the first major thing, though some would say it was the Brown versus Board of Education integration of schools decision in 1954. The Supreme Court, seen as the enemy of traditional values beginning in 54. So the fight over racial integration was huge and remains a huge part of politics, right? But then you had the Supreme Court decisions related to the role of religion You had the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, which changed the landscape of our racial politics. You had the sexual revolution, feminist movement, the gay rights movement. We also had immigration legislation that opened the doors to a vast new wave of immigrants, especially from the non-white, non-European parts of the world, and so our country became more racially diverse. You had the anti-Vietnam War protests and the loss of confidence in the United States government and the United States imperium around the world, and abortion legislation. What am I missing, right? I mean, everything seemed to change. And the traditionalist Christian response was to say either no or go slow on all of it. Now, historians of the American religious right, like Randall Balmer, say that abortion became the official focus of the resistance. And it is abortion and abortion rights that has been overturned now by our Supreme Court. But that the real focus of the resistance was race. But you can't underestimate the sexual revolution. You had women having more freedom. The feminist movement was huge. One thing that happened that is often overlooked is the change of family patterns, including the rise of divorce. Divorce doubled in our country in 10 years, the divorce rate. From 1964 to 1975, 11 years. And never really went down again. So everything, so sex, gender, family, abortion, you name it. And the Christian response in general, the conservative Christian response, Catholic and Protestant, was to say, no, this is all bad. Now, race was an exception in some cases, and because racism became kind of socially unacceptable, the anti-civil rights movement people were seen as a little bit more fringy and extreme and a little bit more like wacko, KKK, we're not them. But there was resistance to all the rest of it. And now I would say there's fairly open racism researching as well. So my hypothesis in the book is that Christianity has gotten entangled in the US with a negative reaction to every modern social change since about 1962. And opposition to those changes is being labeled Christian politics. And authoritarianism then is available to be drawn on. We know the truth about how the family should be structured. We know the truth about the status of human life. Even sometimes we know that white people are supposed to be superior, that white supremacist Christianity. And we are going to fight back to take our country back. And now here's my idea. I think from the 40s, 50s, 60s, even into the 70s, early 70s, the idea was we'll take our country back through evangelism and discipleship. We'll win people's hearts for Christ. And then the idea, I think, gradually was that, that strategy failed. We're not able to get our country back that way. Maybe a few converts, but the overall direction of culture continued. So, okay, what we'll do is we will get cozy with one political party and make an alliance. And that was the Christian right strategy, getting cozy with our Republican Party. We'll get our kind of people elected, and that'll turn the country around. And that, while that is still part of the strategy, I think that by the year 2010, 12, a lot of traditionalist Christians felt that strategy had also failed. Because despite all those politicians, despite Reagan and George W. Bush and so on, the direction of culture had really not changed. And when gay marriage was legalized, that was a big deal in 2015. So what if you conclude, and what if you have a major politician who says, the democratic process maybe is not going to set the boundary for our activism? What if we need to go beyond that because so much is at stake and it's rigged anyway? And that, I think, takes us to the moment in which we find ourselves. In chapter 4, I try, in addition to the language of authoritarian reactionary Christianity, by borrowing a phrase from Michael Walzer, one of my favorite political philosophers, in a book called Secular Revolutions. Well, the book is called The Paradox of Liberation, but the paradigm is secular revolutions and religious counter-revolutions. Walzer, who's a Jewish scholar, examines secular revolutions in the post-war period in Israel, India, and Algeria. And he shows that all of them began as secular revolutions trying to create liberal democratic politics in Algeria, India, and Israel. But then he documents how within a generation in each of those countries, the secular state was challenged by a militant religious vision. And the interesting thing about this study is it's Muslim, Jewish, and actually, Muslim, Jewish, and Hindu, right? None of them Christians. And so he does an analysis of why it is that the original founding secular democratic vision was essentially overwhelmed by a religious vision within a generation. And I focus on the developments in Israel, but what I think is most interesting is this language of secular revolution, religious counter-revolution, because I think it very much applies to this moment. In fact, I was able to find in the American literature on the conservative side, people saying it is time for a religious counter-revolution to the secular revolution of the 1960s or since the 1960s. So religious counter-revolutionary movement. And as soon as you start using the language of revolution, as we talked about a little bit earlier, a revolution, especially in the American setting, there's that dynamic of the possibility of violence. And that dynamic was actualized on January 6th. So on one hand, authoritarian, reactionary Christianity. On the other hand, you might say religious counter-revolution to the secular revolution that is believed to be imposing, woke totalitarianism on American culture or whatever. So here I quote this guy, Glenn Elmers, who worked for the Claremont Institute, which is a conservative group out of California. It's all hands on deck as we enter the counter-revolutionary moment, as we take America back. All hands on deck. There's something also to note about the American setting. I don't know if this is as true elsewhere. The language of apocalypse, of cosmic struggle, of the demonizing of people on the opposite side. It's not unusual to hear the most hardline Christian folks in America describe the other side as demonic, literally of the devil. And when you're dealing with demons, you're not doing incrementalist voting politics. You're talking about holy war, right? And that is more visible in the rhetoric of U.S. politics than I've ever seen it in my life. Also, if you're doing revolution, counter-revolution, and apocalypse and cosmic warfare, it's like politics has been heightened to a religious fervor that is a dangerous fever pitch to think about politics. I would say for the last 20 years, I've heard from both the left and the right this statement: this is the most important election of our lifetime. And America as we know it is at stake. I mean, it isn't just who's going to win the by-election and whatever. I mean, it's so much more cosmic than that. But when you load that kind of cosmic pressure onto politics, it threatens democracy. Democracy needs to be less apocalyptic than that on a general basis.
That's interesting.
So I would say that when you're fighting a religious, cultural, ideological war for ultimate stakes, democracy is fine if you win. But if you don't win, democracy may not be a matter of ultimate loyalty. And you can actually see in scholarly literature, and not just in the frenzied social media world, people using this language. It may be time to radically reconsider our political arrangements, etc. Another person from the Claremont Institute said, if you're actually in a war, you behave differently. You're less inclined to compromise. In a war, you don't negotiate until you've won. So this is the rhetoric of our politics right now in the U.S. Authoritarian reactionary Christians who are doing a counter-revolution or attempting religious counter-revolution are challenging church-state arrangements in the US that are 235 years old. You have parliamentarians, legislators saying, this whole disestablishment of religion thing, this whole separation of church and state thing, either it was never real or it never really was what was supposed to happen, or we need to reconsider it. People are hoping for a godly Christian republic of some type in which their version of religious majoritarian values becomes the official version of the state. And if you can't get there democratically, maybe you can get Donald Trump to help you get there, or somebody like Donald Trump. What I suggest is authoritarian reactionary Christianity is a phenomenon you can name and see in other countries. And so I embark on country studies, a total of 7 countries. The 2 historical studies are in France in the 19th and early 20th century, and in Germany in the same time period. And so I won't go through all of that, but France and Germany. I do like this phrase from Fritz Stern, the politics of cultural despair. And that is what he uses to describe reactionary politics in Germany. And I also think it's interesting to see the whole scope of the despair. We are against urban Germany, industrial Germany, capitalism, materialism, bourgeois Germany, secular, rationalist, scientific, bureaucratic, pluralist, Jewish, democratic, modern Germany. We're against all of it. We want rural, agrarian, cooperative, organic, spiritual, blood and soil, religious, even if it's quasi-Germanic Christianity, quasi-Christian Germanism, spiritualist, anti-scientific, anti-Jewish. In other words, this was a lot of the ideology that was in the air long before Hitler was even born. And it helped to lay the groundwork for what happened there. So this, when you look in the historical studies, you see that the anti-modern reaction had a lot broader dimension than just the kind of moral concerns that we're talking about now. And then in the modern studies, I have a lovely fun chapter on Putin and Russia. And this was written after the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And you can actually see a heightening of the rhetoric of Putin and Russian Orthodox Patriarch Kirill, that what they are doing, what is happening today in the field of international relations is about human salvation. Basically, we are saving Russia and Ukraine from secularism, liberalism, the West, gay rights, gay parades, stuff like that. And then I go to Poland, and the good news out of Poland is that law and justice, authoritarian, reactionary, mainly Catholic party was just defeated in elections last Sunday. But now there's delays in actually doing the parliamentary process to let a new government be formed. But same thing, it looks like against significant odds, the liberal trend of Polish politics in the last decade or so was voted out by its people. And so we'll see what happens there. And then Hungary. Viktor Orban's Hungary, a dangerous model for how religion can be used to fuel democratic backsliding. In the US, Hungary is a darling of the right wing right now. The Orban's, once again, the model. I am your strong man. I am your defender. I will save you from godless, secular liberalism, with a nice revival of the anti-Semitism, throw that in there too, homophobia. And then Orban is especially known for his ingenious snips at the rule of law, free and fair elections, judicial independence, and all the things that were mentioned earlier as 2 characteristics of a democracy. So Orban looks to be president for life at this point. And Hungary is, in the EU, one of the least constructive players at this point, because Hungary really aligns more with Russia, both in its politics and its kind of strategy geopolitically, than any other country in Europe. And then I talk about Brazil with the recently defeated President Jair Bolsonaro, the relationship between Bolsonaro's Brazil and Trump's U.S. was hand in glove. Shared figures, personalities, strategies, rhetoric. Brazilian scholars call Jair Bolsonaro a right-wing pan-Christian figure who unites conservative competitors in the religious marketplace. Bolsonaro managed simultaneously to be Catholic, Pentecostal, and evangelical, which took some doing, but he did it, and won on the same kind of agenda of fighting those liberals, fighting the secular forces, fighting wokeism, standing against gay rights and pluralism and all that liberal stuff. And with the same strategies of attacking the independent media and civil society, lots of corruption, political violence, all of that. And also Bolsonaro had the same strategy of raising doubts about the fairness of the election. But in his case, when he did lose, he was hemmed in by the structures that made it impossible for him to manipulate. There was enough independence left of the judiciary and so on for him not to be able to overturn the results of the election. So you remember what happened? There was another run on their capital. And eventually that didn't succeed, and he was banished to Miami. I believe he ended up in Florida. And then I talk about Trump. In a sense, and you're probably not surprised by this, but trying to make sense of what we've just been living through politically is really why I wrote this book. I start that chapter with a speech by this infamous pastor in the U.S. named Greg Locke, who on the eve of the January 6th insurrection rallied the troops with a long speech. I've got to read you some of this. This is just too good too awful to not read. Imagine hearing this sermon. This is what he said to a bunch of people, many of whom ended up storming the Capitol the next day. America is the last bastion of Christian freedom. It's the last bastion of capitalism. I declare unto you that President Donald Trump is going to stay for 4 more years in the White House. This is after he'd already lost. We're a mighty army. They've got to listen. They can't ignore us. Our churches have been backed into a corner. We pray for Enrique Tarrio, and Lord, we pray for his organization, which was the Proud Boys, which was a militia that helped to storm the Capitol, and most of those leaders are now in jail with very long sentences. And Lord, they may get a bum rap on the news media, so anti-media, this awful media who give a bum rap to the militias. But we just thank God that we can lock shields, that we can come shoulder to shoulder with people that still stand up for this nation and still love the rights and the freedoms that we have. Because Lord, we got to recognize the fact if we don't have convictions worth dying for, we don't even know what living really is. So God, help us to live, help us to fight, and if need be, lay down our life for this nation. So that was a rallying the troops sermon on the eve of January 6th. You got to have the book just for that sermon. Yeah. I strongly recommend, available at so where was I? So essentially what we had in the U.S. was democratic erosion that happened gradually, and then a full-blown attack on democracy itself. We have had when the Democrats had control of Congress, they were able to do an investigation that revealed quite clearly what happened, what went wrong. But when the Republicans are in control of Congress, none of that matters. And so right now in Congress, you have people in authority, including the brand new Speaker of the House, who supported the lies about the election, who voted against certifying the election. In other words, right now, by a small margin in the Republican-controlled House, the people who were all in on this are the ones in charge. And that's really, really scary. Now, there was some good news in 2022. Closer to the events of the insurrection, a number of candidates were put up in different states who were basically mini Trumps, and they mainly lost, which was encouraging. This is not what the majority of Americans want, but you don't have to have a majority to do a constitutional coup. You just have to have enough of a minority. and have things break your way. So this right-wing radicalization has sunk in deeply into the American church. Conservative writers are seeing it in general. Essentially, there is no distinction between the right-wing American church and right-wing politics. They're the same movement. And so scholars who write about, or journalists who write about American conservatism say things like, the alienation from and antagonism toward American culture could turn into a general opposition to the constitutional order on the right. And that is, I think, what we're seeing. So having done the country studies, and I'm going to be interested to see what the reception of these country studies is in the different countries. If anybody pays attention, I hope so. But then I say, here's our 3 resources. So let me go over these, and then let's have a free-for-all, talk about everything, okay? I already mentioned that the Baptist democratic tradition is a great resource for defending democracy. And here, a major source of my argument comes from my teacher, Glenn Stassen, a legendary Baptist ethicist who died a few years ago. So Stassen says the Baptists had insisted that the way Jesus made disciples was by teaching and persuasion, not coercion. Stassen argued that democracy should be supported by Christians because it contributed to civil and international peace, that it was originally an innovation of Christian dissenters under state church oppression, that Baptists argued explicitly by the mid-17th century, rejecting authoritarian government, embracing religious liberty, embracing religious disestablishment and the free exercise of religion, and calling for human rights protections and making a variety of expansive proposals. One figure that Stassen loved was Richard Overton, if you know that name. A Baptist freethinker from that period. This chapter also talks about, Richard Overton, I think that's right. Anyway, the significance of congregationalism as a training in democratic practices. That in genuinely congregationalist, Baptistic type churches, people are trained, he says, with an allergy to authoritarianism. And I expand on this in the book, and I talk about how, these congregational churches were some of the earliest experiments in democracy. What is a congregational church? Well, 15 people share a vision. Then they say, let's form a community. And what do they first? They usually write some kind of covenant. Like, we, the undersigned 15 people, agree to form, Mercy Baptist Church under the Lordship of Christ in order to this, and this. And the covenant is like the Constitution. And that brings them into existence as a community. The pastor is not the king of a church like this. The pastor is the servant of a church like this. The people form the community through the covenant, and then they write like bylaws, which are like the laws. And then year by year, decade by decade, they govern themselves in keeping with their constitution, in accordance with their bylaws, to advance the common good under the Lordship of Christ as they understand it. The only thing different about this in modern liberal democracy, well, there's more of a sense of a common good. There's more of a sense of responsibilities, not just rights. And in a modern liberal democracy, at least in the American version, the under the Lordship of Christ part is taken out. But I argue in the book that congregational democracy trains people in the practices of democracy. And we need to protect congregational democracy and make it a training ground for participation in democratic politics more generally. And so this raises interesting questions about how is the health of our Baptistic congregational democracies right now. And that's a question that can be asked anywhere, including here. Right? And then I talk about a distinctive dimension of our heritage in the U.S., the Black Christian democratic tradition. Randall Jelks, historian, says Black America flipped the script on a racialized democratic state. it is black people's fight that makes the United States exceptional. So I'll pause here for just a second. Part of what our understanding about the U.S. environment is that our democracy was deeply damaged from the beginning by our racism. The Constitution, with all of its glorious structures, and the Declaration of Independence, with all of its affirmations of values, also allowed slavery. And so what is now called white supremacism, and often white Christian supremacism, compromised American democracy from the beginning. It was never consistent with a Christian vision, but it was made to be consistent through hypocrisy and compromise. It was never consistent with an Enlightenment vision of the dignity of all, or even a Christian humanist vision, but it was made to be consistent through hypocrisy and compromise. So you might say that racism has been baked into Western democracies since colonial days, including the U.S., and that contradiction has desperately wounded our practice of democracy. In an effort to hold on to white Christian cultural and political hegemony undergirds authoritarian reactionary Christianity today. So one way to tell the story is to take it all the way back to the founding of a lot of the Western democracies, and to say that what we have had has actually been a democracy for white people, in which people of color are allowed to be there as a servant class or a dominated class. And that every effort to challenge that has been beaten back violently by white people. And so what the civil rights movement in the US did in the 60s was to make a significant breakthrough to say, we're not going to have a whiteocracy anymore. We're going to actually have a multiracial democracy, a pluralistic multiracial democracy, and that white people have been hysterically reacting against that since about 1963. And that Donald Trump is the apotheosis of that reaction. He embodies visceral white contempt for people of color. It drips from his every utterance where he mentions anything about race. But he also, one reason he got elected and is a threat to be reelected is because a lot of Americans find he represents their viscera, their gut, when it comes to race. So I saw this quote I was thinking it was I.F. Stone, an American public commentator, who said during the civil rights years, okay, this is it. Either America moves forward to be a multiracial democracy, or it withdraws to be basically white fascism. And that is another way to describe where we find ourselves right now. So here I find white Christian nationalism to be pretty helpful language. You have people who are essentially arguing, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, this is a white Christian nation. This is a white traditional values Christian nation. You are allowed to stay here as long as you understand that this is our country. This is a white traditional Christian nation, and if you let us rule it according to our values, we'll let you stay here. But that's about it, which sounds an awful lot like apartheid South Africa about 1948. And I think that's what's in the air right now. But the black democratic tradition has been resisting this since the 17th century. Has been saying, you say you're a democracy, include us. Include us on equal terms. The black democratic tradition, often headquartered in the churches, has been fighting for true multiracial democracy for all these hundreds of years. For a real democracy with full equality, civil rights, and political participation. To the extent that the black church has been a headquarters of this movement, this has been a Christian movement. By the way, I live in Atlanta, and you know Atlanta was the headquarters of the civil rights movement in a lot of ways. Ebenezer Baptist Church is about 10 miles from my house. And the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church is a man named Raphael Warnock, who is also a senator from Georgia now, embodying this tradition. And also, this also raises interesting questions about Christian proclamation and mission. In the black church, not always, but far more often than in the white church in the US, the demand for democracy, for the rule of law, in which everybody is included, for human rights, has resounded from the pulpit, not just in politics. In other words, they're more integrated. The white churches have been hesitant to do that, with some exceptions, especially in the South. So in other words, what advocates of this tradition have said, and I think it's not too much, that the black church social justice tradition has been headquarters both of truer discipleship and of better politics. And so nowadays, a lot of us who come out of the white Baptist world are realizing that the only way forward is by learning the lessons that have already been articulated in the black churches for about 300, 400 years. And then the language of covenant. The Massachusetts Constitution in the 18th century said, "The body politic is a social compact by which the whole people covenants with each citizen and each citizen with the whole people." This is coming, I think, out of the Puritan influence in New England. But let's think about covenant. And I understand we have some people here who have been working on covenant, and so we can talk about this. This is the last section of my talk. We know that covenant is a central organizing category in Scripture. It affects theology, law, ethics. It has played a central role in several Protestant traditions, notably Reformed and Baptist. A covenant is a sacred agreement with mutual obligations before God and human partners, or involving human partners. So it could be God making covenant with us with God, but it can also be us making covenant with each other, you might say, before God. Like when people get married, they make a covenant with each other, but that covenant is before God and the community. Though a lot of the early political use of the covenant language, like I'm not an expert on this period, but as I read the Puritans talking about covenant, a lot of times their covenant was theocratic and exclusive. In other words, only people who understood theology and law and ethics the way they did really counted in the covenant community. I think it does have democratic potential if we broaden it. If we think of the body politic as a covenanted community, not just of people of our confession or our faith or our race or our national origin, but of everybody in the community. Martin Luther King already saw this, and in a seminary paper, he was already saying as a 22-year-old, what we need is a new democratic covenant in America that could repair the disastrous weaknesses of the original U.S. whites-only democratic covenant. So I kind of wrap up the book by calling for a renewed understanding of covenant obligations in a democracy. That in a sense, both religious and non-religious people can maybe embrace the idea that society is about more than free individuals maximizing their life choices, but instead about people who care about the community's common good or the flourishing of all, not just my children, but your children, not just my neighborhood, but your neighborhood, and who can covenant before God if they believe in God, to be committed to the well-being of the whole. We need a vision of the common good, not just of my individual rights. And I also argue that we need to renew the language of covenant for various government officials. You know, we have some of this still. I don't know if this happens here, but when a president is inaugurated in America, they make essentially a covenant oath. They raise their hand and they say, "I do solemnly swear," was it to preserve, protect, and defend the United States Constitution, something like that. They make a covenant. They swear on, they put their hand on a Bible and swear that. In 2016, we had a person put his hand on a Bible and swear something who had never kept a covenant promise in his entire life. In other words, if covenant was still real as a concept, then one thing we might ask of anybody running for president or any other high office is, do they have a record of keeping their covenants? Are they covenant-honoring people? in any other area, like you don't want to sign a contract with a business where you learn that they don't routinely keep their promises. I understand there's covenant here. I want to hear about your covenant. Is it real? It's real by recitation. It's real by practice. It's real by accountability, and it's real as the leaders of the community make it real. So I argue for a renewal of covenant, even in pluralistic democratic environments. We can still speak of covenant, and Christians can add the dimension of our covenant is with God and with the people as a whole. I have an altar call. Friends, now listen, I'd like to... No, okay, I can go southern if you want, but here I have 4 points. I say, remember that Jesus is Lord, and that the way of Jesus does not get suspended when we think we have an emergency. Recall biblical resources. You're going to notice the alliteration because I'm a Baptist preacher. Remember that Jesus is Lord. Recall biblical resources like these. Let me go over them. God is creator of all and made in God's image. God makes covenants with beloved yet flawed people. Law applies equally to all, with special attention to the vulnerable. That's classic Hebrew Bible. Prophets teach social justice under covenant and law. We need prophets. The Bible offers a vision of a perfected creation or kingdom of God. But meanwhile, amid the imperfection, we do justice, we love, and we wait. We need a theology of the in-between time. We are not bringing in the kingdom of God in our politics. We are waiting for us. So that makes me a non kind of postmillennial. We live in the in-between time, and we do our best to keep our covenant with our neighbors in this in-between time. We need to reconnect with constructive traditions like the ones I've mentioned, the Baptistic, covenantal, and Black Christian struggle for democracy. We need to recommit to a healthier Christian identity in which inclusive social changes do not drive us into angry identitarian politics. Just because we share the society on equal terms with people of multiple ethnic backgrounds, religious traditions, and so on, does not mean the society is bad. It just means that it's changed. This should not be so hard. There's nothing Christian about identitarian reactionary politics. We need to recommit to a healthier practice of democracy and the rule of law, seeking the common good, bearing a non-coercive public witness, advocating for everyone's civil rights, resisting authoritarianism, and participating in democratic citizenship. So, thus endeth my sermon. Having been excluded from many invitations because of some of the things that I have written, I appreciate being invited into a community whose boundaries include me. So I feel very much at home here, and I've loved being here today, and I hope for opportunities to come back.
Well, the privilege is all ours.
Absolutely.